The Mafia boss came home early and almost fainted when he saw what his black maid was doing. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The mansion's grand doors swung open with a soft creak as the early evening sun cast its last golden rays across the marble floors. Dominic Valentino, the infamous Mafia boss, walked briskly down the corridor, his mind preoccupied with the demands of his day. His tailored black suit, so perfectly fitted, seemed to absorb the light as he moved, a man accustomed to power, to control, to fear. But today, there was an unfamiliar feeling gnawing at him, something he couldn't quite place. He had decided to return home earlier than expected, eager for a quiet evening. But what he didn't know was that his routine would be disrupted in the most unexpected way. As he entered the main living room, he immediately froze, his heart rate quickening. There, in the center of the room, stood Maria, his black maid. But something was off. She was kneeling, her hands trembling as she held a small, injured dog against her chest, whispering soft words to it in a soothing tone. The dog, once healthy and strong, now looked frail, its fur matted with dirt and its breathing shallow. Dominic's gaze narrowed. Maria, the maid who had worked for him for over 2 years, had always been an enigma. She was quiet, reserved, always doing her duties without ever stepping out of line. But now, she was doing something completely unexpected, something that defied the cold, calculating world Dominic had built around himself. His sharp eyes flickered from Maria to the dog, a mix of confusion and disbelief settling in his chest. He had never seen this side of her before. Her stoic demeanor had always been her shield, but here, in this moment, she was unguarded, vulnerable even, caring for a creature that seemed to have no place in the ruthless life Dominic led. His chest tightened. He had spent years building his empire on loyalty, respect, and fear. His men, his business associates, all knew their place, all knew their boundaries. But this wasn't part of the deal. As Maria carefully adjusted the dog, trying to ease its pain, Dominic took a step forward, his boots making a soft thud against the floor. Maria didn't look up. She didn't seem to notice his presence at all. She was lost in her own world, whispering words of comfort to the animal, as if nothing else mattered. Dominic's heart skipped a beat. Why was she doing this? What was it about this fragile creature that made her act like this? His mind raced with questions, but he couldn't bring himself to speak. Instead, he stood there, watching, feeling a strange sense of helplessness creeping over him. The powerful Mafia boss, reduced to a bystander in his own home. For a brief moment, everything else faded away. The business, the power, the fear, until there was only Maria, the maid, and the dog she cared for. The silence in the room was deafening. And then, almost imperceptibly, Maria turned her head, her eyes locking with his for the first time. Her gaze was soft, almost apologetic, as if she had been caught in the act of something forbidden. "Sir, I didn't mean to," she started, but Dominic interrupted her with a single gesture, a hand raised to silence her. His voice, when it came, was low and measured. "What are you doing?" he asked, his tone a mix of curiosity and something else, something unfamiliar. Maria took a deep breath, carefully setting the dog down on a plush cushion, her hands trembling as she did so. "He was hurt, sir," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I found him in the yard. He was abandoned, alone." Dominic stared at her, his mind whirling. He had never seen her like this, soft, compassionate, almost human. He had always thought of her as just another servant, a part of the background. But now, she was something more. "And you took care of him?" he asked, almost incredulously. Maria nodded, her eyes downcast. "He needed help. No one else was here." Dominic felt an unfamiliar stirring in his chest, something akin to admiration, but also guilt. He couldn't explain it. The cold, calculating man he had been for so many years suddenly felt out of place. In this moment, Maria, the maid, had done something he hadn't expected. She had shown kindness, real, unguarded kindness. And in doing so, She had made him question everything he had ever believed about power, about loyalty, and about people like her. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the only sound the soft breathing of the dog as it lay on the cushion. And for the first time in his life, Dominic Valentino, the Mafia boss, didn't know what to do next. Dominic stood there, his eyes locked on Maria, the black maid who had shown him a side of herself he had never expected. The dog she had saved, now curled up on a plush cushion, looked up at him with those wide, trusting eyes. Maria, her hands still trembling from the shock of what had just happened, avoided his gaze, focusing instead on the small creature that had unknowingly brought the two of them together in a moment of shared humanity. The air in the room seemed heavier now, charged with something Dominic couldn't quite understand. For the first time, he saw Maria as more than just an employee. She wasn't the cold, invisible figure that had always moved in and out of his life without making a sound. No, now she was someone who cared, who showed compassion in a world that rarely rewarded such things. He cleared his throat, breaking the silence that hung between them. "You took care of him," he said, his voice softer than he intended. Maria nodded, her voice barely a whisper. He needed help. He was all alone out there. Dominic's eyes softened for a moment as he watched her. The hardness that had always been a part of him, the ruthless mafia boss who commanded respect through fear, seemed to meld away in the face of Maria's simple act of kindness. He didn't know how to process the feeling that was stirring within him, but it was there, undeniable and unsettling. He had spent his life building an empire, fighting to protect it, but here, in this quiet moment, he felt vulnerable. Something in him wanted to protect Maria, to ensure she was never hurt. He shook his head, trying to focus, trying to regain control of the situation. But Maria wasn't done yet. She gently stroked the dog's fur, her fingers lingering on its fragile body. "I just wanted to make sure he was okay," she murmured, almost as if speaking to herself. "I know what it's like to be left behind, to feel like no one cares." Her words, simple as they were, struck a chord with Dominic. He had built his empire on loyalty, on control, but what did that matter if no one cared about you when you were truly alone? "Maria," he began, his voice a bit firmer now, "you don't need to explain yourself. But you have to understand, this is not something I expected. People like you, people like me." He paused, searching for the right words. "We don't do things like this. We don't let ourselves care." She looked up at him then, her eyes meeting his for the first time in what felt like an eternity. There was no fear in them, no hesitation, only quiet strength. "Maybe that's the problem, sir," she said, her voice steady. "Maybe we've forgotten how to care." Dominic felt his chest tighten, the weight of her words settling deep in his bones. He had spent years building walls around himself, keeping others at arm's length, convinced that it was the only way to survive. But Maria, this maid, this woman he had always seen as little more than a servant, had just shattered that illusion with a single, simple act of kindness. He took a deep breath, his mind racing. What did this mean? What was he supposed to do now? For a moment, he was unsure. But then, something inside him clicked. He couldn't ignore this feeling, this strange sense of connection to Maria. I've never seen this side of you," he said quietly, his voice betraying the unease he felt. Maria gave him a small, faint smile. "Most people don't. It's easier for them to pretend I'm just a maid, just someone who does their work and disappears. But I'm more than that." Dominic nodded slowly. "Yes, I can see that now." They stood there for a long moment, neither of them saying anything, just letting the silence settle around them. For the first time in his life, Dominic wasn't sure of the next step to take. He was used to controlling everything, making decisions with the force of his will. But this was different. Maria had done something he hadn't expected, something that made him see her in an entirely new light. And in that moment, Dominic realized that he couldn't just go back to how things were. He had to change, even if he didn't fully understand what that change would look like. "You don't need to apologize for what you did," Dominic finally said, his voice more determined now. "In fact, I think you've done something no one else could have." Maria looked up at him, her expression softening. "What do you mean, sir? You've made me realize something. I've been so focused on building this empire, on making sure everything runs according to my plan, that I've forgotten what really matters." He paused, searching her eyes for some kind of understanding. You've reminded me that there's more to life than just power and control. Maria didn't say anything at first, but the way she looked at him told him she understood. She had always known, deep down, that the world Dominic lived in was not the world he truly wanted. And now, for the first time, it seemed like he was beginning to see that for himself. The moment hung between them, suspended in time. And as Dominic stood there, watching Maria with new eyes, he realized that nothing would ever be the same again. Dominic stood motionless in the middle of the room, his mind still spinning from the realization that Maria, the quiet and stoic maid, had shown him something he had long forgotten: humanity. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to feel something he rarely felt: uncertainty. The air between them was thick with the kind of silence that spoke louder than words ever could. Maria, still kneeling beside the dog, avoided Dominic's gaze, her hands lightly brushing the fur of the animal as if to reassure both herself and the fragile creature she had saved. The room was still, but the weight of everything that had happened lingered, pressing down on them both. Dominic had seen many things in his life: violence, betrayal, loyalty, but nothing had ever unsettled him like this. His gaze softened as he watched Maria, and for the first time, he wondered how he had failed to see the real her all this time. "Maria," he said quietly, breaking the silence, his voice a little lower than usual. "I never expected this from you." She looked up at him, her eyes wide with an emotion he couldn't place, a mix of fear and determination. "I don't expect you to understand," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But sometimes, a person has to do what feels right." Dominic stepped closer, his boots making a soft thud against the floor. He had always been a man of power, of control, but here, in this moment, he felt neither. "What do you mean by that?" he asked, his voice searching, almost as if he was asking himself the same question. Maria took a deep breath, then glanced down at the dog, who was now resting comfortably on the cushion, its breathing steady. "I mean," she began slowly, "that not everything in life is about power or survival. Sometimes, it's about doing something for someone or something else, without expecting anything in return." The words hung in the air, and Dominic felt them sink into him like a heavy weight. He had never allowed himself the luxury of compassion. It was a weakness, something that didn't belong in his world. But here was Maria, offering him a glimpse into something he had long buried, something that terrified him because it made him question everything he thought he knew about himself. "You're right," he said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. "You're right." There was a long pause, and Dominic found himself standing next to her, staring at the dog as it rested. The Mafia boss, the man who controlled empires, felt a strange stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in years: empathy. He turned to Maria, his eyes locking onto hers. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice steadier now, more composed. Maria looked up at him, her expression still gentle but firm. "We take care of him. That's what happens now. We make sure he's safe." Dominic nodded, the weight of her words settling heavily on his chest. He had never truly understood what it meant to take care of someone, other than himself. He had always been the one in control, the one to dictate what happened next. But now, with Maria, something was different. He didn't feel the need to control her or the situation. Instead, he felt an overwhelming desire to protect her, to ensure that nothing happened to her or the dog she had saved. "You really care about this animal," Dominic said, his voice a little softer, almost as if he was still processing the reality of the situation. Maria gave him a small smile. "Yes, I do. He's been through a lot, and he deserves a chance." Dominic was quiet for a moment, taking in her words. He had always seen people as tools, as means to an end. But Maria was different. She wasn't a tool. She was a person with emotions, with values, with a heart. And in that moment, Dominic felt something stir inside him, a realization that he couldn't ignore. "I want to make sure you're safe," Dominic said suddenly, his voice a little more assertive now. Maria looked up at him in surprise. "Safe?" she asked. "What do you mean?" Dominic's jaw tightened, his mind already moving to protect her. "I mean, you've just shown me something I've never seen before," he said, his eyes searching hers. "You've shown me a side of you that I didn't know existed. And now, I want to make sure that you're not hurt, that you're taken care of." Maria was silent for a moment, her eyes searching his. She had always been just a maid, someone who moved in and out of his life without making an impression. But now, Dominic was offering her something more than she ever expected. "I don't need anything from you, Dominic," she said quietly, her voice steady but soft. "I just need to know that I'm doing the right thing, and that I can keep doing what I'm doing, helping." Dominic felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. "I'll make sure of it," he said, his voice firm with resolve. "I'll make sure that nothing happens to you. You've earned that much." Maria looked at him, a faint smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But this is just what I do. It's nothing special." Dominic's gaze softened as he studied her. "It's everything," he said simply. And for the first time, as he stood there beside her, watching her care for the dog, Dominic realized that he had a lot more to learn about compassion, about kindness, and about what it truly meant to be human. The next few days passed in a blur, but for Dominic, they were anything but ordinary. Every time he passed by Maria, he found himself noticing her in a new light. He was used to people bowing to him, following orders without question, but Maria wasn't like that. She didn't seek his approval, didn't look to him for validation. Instead, she simply carried on with her work, showing kindness and strength that he hadn't expected. It was strange, but every time she spoke to him, or when he saw her quietly taking care of the dog, he felt something inside him shift. The way she moved through the mansion with quiet grace, never demanding anything, yet somehow commanding respect without saying a word, made him wonder what he had been missing all these years. One evening, after a long day of meetings and phone calls, Dominic returned home later than usual. He didn't want to admit it, but part of him looked forward to seeing Maria, to seeing how she would be when he wasn't expecting it. When he stepped inside, he noticed the house was unusually quiet. The staff was finishing their shifts, and the rest of the house was already preparing for the night. But there, in the corner of the living room, he saw her again. Maria was sitting on the couch, reading something quietly. The dog, now looking healthier, was curled up beside her, dozing peacefully. There was a calmness about her, a stillness that seemed to put everything else in the mansion to rest. She looked up when she heard him enter, her eyes meeting his with an unreadable expression. "You're home late, sir," she said, her voice soft but steady. Dominic nodded, taking off his coat and setting it on the chair. "Yes, I had a lot to catch up on." He paused, noticing how peaceful the room felt in contrast to the usual hustle and bustle of his life. He could hear the soft ticking of the clock in the hallway, the distant hum of the mansion's systems running in the background. It was so different from the world he was used to. He cleared his throat and stepped further into the room. "How's the dog?" he asked, his voice sounding a little more casual than he intended. Maria smiled faintly. "He's doing much better now. I think he'll be okay." There was a warmth in her voice as she spoke about the dog, and for a moment, Dominic saw something in her that he hadn't before, a genuine care, not just for animals, but for everything and everyone around her. He didn't know why, but something about that smile made him feel a sense of relief he hadn't expected. He walked toward her, standing near the couch, but not sitting down. He didn't want to disturb the peaceful moment. "You've done a good job with him," Dominic said quietly. Maria looked up at him, a slight surprise in her expression. "Thank you, sir," she replied, the sincerity in her voice almost catching him off guard. They stood there for a moment, the air between them thick with unspoken words. For Dominic, it was a feeling of discomfort he couldn't shake. He had always been a man who controlled everything, his empire, his world, his people. But Maria was something different, something that didn't fit into the neat boxes he had built for himself. He didn't know why, but he felt a pull toward her that he couldn't explain. "Maria," he began, his voice steady but softer than usual, "I've been thinking." She tilted her head slightly, waiting for him to continue. "About what you said, about doing things because they're the right thing to do." Maria looked at him curiously. "Yes, I think I've been wrong about a lot of things," he said, his voice tinged with a rare vulnerability. "I've spent my whole life thinking that power, control, and loyalty were the only things that mattered. But now, I'm starting to wonder if there's more to it than that." Maria didn't say anything at first, but her gaze softened as she looked at him. She could see that he was struggling, not with his empire or his position, but with something deeper, something more personal. "What do you mean?" she asked quietly, her voice gentle. Dominic ran a hand through his hair, looking down for a moment. I don't know, he admitted. But when I see you, when I see how you care for others, it makes me question everything I've believed. Maria's expression was unreadable, but there was a quiet understanding in her eyes. She had known, of course. She had known all along that he wasn't as unbreakable as he tried to seem. It's not easy, she said softly. To care. To let yourself care. It's easier to shut everything out, to focus only on what you can control. Dominic nodded slowly. I've been doing that for years. There was a long pause, and for the first time, Dominic felt like he was being truly seen, not as a mafia boss, not as a powerful man, but as a person. But maybe it's time I stopped, he said, almost to himself. Maria looked at him with quiet understanding. Maybe it is. There was a stillness between them, the kind that held the weight of everything that had been said and everything that hadn't. Dominic, the man who had always been in control, was standing here, admitting something he had never allowed himself to feel before, vulnerability. He didn't know what to do with it, but in that moment, with Maria sitting across from him, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he didn't need to know everything. He didn't need to have all the answers. For once, it was enough to simply be present, to allow himself to feel something other than fear, power, or control. You've made me think, Dominic said, his voice soft. Maybe that's all I needed. Maria gave him a small, understanding smile. Sometimes, all it takes is a different perspective. Dominic spent the next few days in a daze, unable to shake the feeling that something had shifted within him. The conversation he had with Maria lingered in his mind long after she had gone about her duties, leaving him with more questions than answers. He had spent his entire life building a world where power, control, and fear ruled. But now, in the quiet moments when he allowed himself to think, he couldn't help but wonder if he had been wrong all along. The guilt that had begun to creep into his heart was a foreign feeling, something he had never allowed himself to experience. For years, he had been the one others feared, the one they obeyed without question. But now, as he stood in the midst of his grand mansion, surrounded by wealth and power, he felt an emptiness he had never known before. It was a dissonance he couldn't ignore. He tried to push it away, to focus on his empire, but every time his mind wandered, it returned to Maria. How had she changed him so profoundly in such a short time? What was it about her quiet strength, her compassion, that had unlocked something within him that he had buried for so long? It was the strangest feeling, like a part of him was finally being awakened, a part he had suppressed. In order to survive the ruthless world he had built. One evening, as the sun began to set and cast a golden light over the mansion's marble floors, Dominic found himself walking toward the kitchen. He didn't know why he was going there, but something inside him pulled him toward that space. It wasn't the usual place where business was done or where deals were made. It was just the kitchen, a room that had always felt ordinary, out of place in his world of opulence. But tonight, it felt like the right place. As he walked in, he saw Maria, her back to him as she prepared dinner. The scent of fresh herbs and roasting meat filled the air, a simple yet comforting aroma. The dog, now fully recovered, lay at her feet, content and at ease. Dominic stood in the doorway, watching her for a moment, unsure of what to say. He had never felt this kind of hesitation before. Normally, he knew exactly how to command a room, how to make people respond to him. But with Maria, it was different. "You're cooking?" he asked, his voice sounding almost surprised. Maria turned to him, a small smile playing on her lips. "I thought it might be a nice change," she replied, her voice warm and steady. "You've been working so hard lately, and I thought you could use a good meal." Dominic raised an eyebrow. "A good meal?" he repeated, his tone almost teasing. "Is that your way of saying I'm looking a bit worn out?" Maria's smile widened slightly. "Not at all," she said softly, though there was a glimmer of humor in her eyes. "But I can tell you've been under a lot of stress lately. Sometimes, a good meal can do wonders." Dominic stepped further into the room, the unfamiliar warmth of the kitchen making him feel strangely at ease. He hadn't realized how much he had needed this quiet, simple moment. He had been so focused on the external world, on keeping control, that he had forgotten what it was like to just exist, to be present. He watched as Maria set the table with careful precision, her movements graceful and unhurried. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was simply doing what she had always done, taking care of things without asking for anything in return. It was a quality he had never Really appreciated until now. I don't know what to say, Dominic admitted, his voice lower than usual. Maria paused for a moment, looking up at him with a soft expression. You don't have to say anything, sir, she said, her voice kind but firm. I'm just here to help. The simplicity of her words hit him harder than he expected. In all his years, he had never allowed anyone to just help him without expecting something in return. It was a foreign concept, one that made him feel vulnerable in a way he had never felt before. But with Maria, he didn't feel judged. He didn't feel like he had to be anything other than what he was in that moment. For the first time in years, Dominic allowed himself to relax, to let go of the walls he had so carefully constructed around himself. Maria finished setting the table, then turned to face him. I hope you like it, she said with a hint of shyness. Dominic met her gaze, his expression softer than usual. I'm sure I will, he said sincerely. They sat down to eat in comfortable silence, the sound of their utensils the only noise in the room. For Dominic, it was a welcome change from the constant chatter and scheming that filled his world. There was no pressure here, no expectation. Just a meal, just two people sharing a quiet moment. As they ate, Dominic found himself thinking about how different his life had become since meeting Maria. She had opened his eyes to a side of himself he hadn't known existed, a side that longed for connection and understanding rather than power and control. For the first time in years, he realized that there was more to life than what he had built. He had spent so long focusing on his empire, on maintaining his dominance, that he had forgotten what it meant to truly live. As they finished their meal, Dominic looked across the table at Maria, his eyes full of gratitude. Thank you, he said quietly. For this. For everything. Maria met his gaze, her expression warm but unassuming. It's nothing, sir, she replied simply. I'm just doing what feels right. Dominic smiled, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time in what felt like forever. Maybe, just maybe, he was finally starting to understand what really mattered. The days that followed were quieter than usual, and yet, they were filled with an undercurrent of tension that Dominic couldn't shake. The time he had spent with Maria, simple moments of peace, of shared meals and quiet conversation, had stirred something in him that he had long buried. His world had always been one of control, of command, where everything was meticulously ordered and predictable. But with Maria, there was no script, no plan, no structure, and it both unsettled and fascinated him. As he moved through his day-to-day, Dominic found himself seeking out those quiet moments when he could interact with Maria. It wasn't just about the dog anymore, or the way she had taken care of it. It was about something deeper, something he couldn't quite define. He found himself watching her when he passed through the hallways, noting the way she moved, the calmness she brought to everything she did. He never asked for this connection, but now that it was there, he didn't want to ignore it. One evening, as the mansion grew quiet and the sounds of distant city life outside faded, Dominic found himself walking toward the kitchen once more. He didn't know why, but it had become a place where he could relax, a place where he could simply exist without the pressure of his empire pressing down on him. Maria was there, as usual, working quietly at the counter. The soft light from the chandelier above cast a warm glow over her, making her appear almost ethereal in the dim room. Dominic watched her for a moment before speaking. Maria, he said, his voice surprisingly soft for someone who was so accustomed to being heard, to being obeyed. She turned to him, a small smile forming on her lips as she set the knife down on the counter. Yes, sir? She asked, her tone gentle but respectful. I've been thinking, he started, but his words seemed to falter. He had never been one to open up, especially not to someone in her position. But for some reason, in that moment, he wanted to. About everything, he continued, his eyes focused on the floor for a moment, avoiding her gaze. About power, control, the life I've built. Maria didn't say anything right away, but she didn't need to. Her silence was comforting, as though she understood more than he had expected. You've made me realize something, Dominic said, his voice low. That maybe there's more to life than just holding power over people. Maybe there's more to it than keeping everyone at a distance. Maria paused, her expression thoughtful. It's not easy to let go of control, she said softly. I know that from experience. Dominic met her gaze then, surprised by the insight in her words. He had always thought of her as just a maid, someone who moved through the mansion quietly, unnoticed. But in that moment, he saw something more. You know what it's like then, he said, his voice carrying a hint of disbelief. To live with the burden of control, of never letting anyone in. Maria nodded, the faintest of smiles tugging at her lips. I do, she replied simply. But I also know that it's okay to let go sometimes. To let others in. It doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. Dominic stared at her, his mind racing. For the first time, he was looking at her not as his maid, not as someone beneath him, but as someone who understood him. Someone who saw through the walls he had spent so long building. I've never been good at that, he admitted. Letting people in. Maria's gaze softened, and for the first time, there was no judgment in her eyes, only understanding. I can tell, she said quietly. But that doesn't mean you can't try. The words settled into him, and for a moment, Dominic felt something shift inside. Something that had been dormant for so long. A part of him that he had kept buried started to stir. It was a sense of longing, of needing connection, of wanting something more than the cold, detached existence he had created for himself. He looked at Maria again, his heart heavy with emotion. I don't know what to do with this, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Maria met his gaze steadily. You don't have to know right away, she said. You just have to be willing to try, to be open. Dominic felt a knot in his chest loosen, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could breathe. It was strange, this feeling. It wasn't something he had planned for, but now that it was there, he couldn't ignore it. I'll try, he said, his voice steady now. I'll try to let go, to stop controlling everything. Maria smiled, and in that smile, Dominic saw something he hadn't seen before. It wasn't just kindness or compassion. It was a recognition, an understanding of the struggle he had faced his entire life. That's all anyone can ask of you, she said gently. As they stood there, in the quiet of the kitchen, a strange sense of peace settled over him. For the first time in years, Dominic felt like he was exactly where he needed to be, not as a mafia boss, not as a man of power, but as someone who was learning to let go, to connect, and to allow himself to be human. And for the first time, he felt like he wasn't alone. The days that followed felt different to Dominic. There was a new sense of calm within him, a quiet shift in how he viewed the world. Maria had shown him that life was more than just a constant push for control, more than building an empire and maintaining power. It was about connections, understanding, and the small moments that made life meaningful. For the first time in a long time, Dominic allowed himself to experience those moments. His world of rules and strategies no longer felt as suffocating as it once had. The house, once just a place of cold luxury, now seemed like a home, something he had never allowed himself to see it as before. But with these changes came the realization that things couldn't stay the same forever. The feelings he had started to develop for Maria were undeniable, but they were complicated. She was his employee, and while that fact had always been clear, the lines were becoming blurred in a way that made him uncomfortable. He didn't know how to navigate this new dynamic. He had never allowed anyone to get close to him, and now, he was faced with a choice: continue to keep her at a distance, or allow himself to explore something deeper with her. One evening, as he stood by his office window, looking out over the city that he had spent so many years controlling, he found himself lost in thought. His phone buzzed on the desk, snapping him out of his reverie. It was a message from one of his associates, asking for a meeting the next morning. Dominic felt a familiar sense of dread wash over him, the pressure of his responsibilities returning in full force. But just as quickly, he realized that he didn't have to let it consume him. He had made a choice. For the first time, he had allowed himself to feel something more than just the cold calculation of a mafia boss. He had allowed himself to care. And with that came a new understanding. He didn't have to let everything else fall apart to maintain his humanity. The next morning, as Dominic prepared for the meeting, he found himself searching for Maria. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he knew he needed to see her. When he finally found her in the kitchen, the sight of her made his heart race, an unfamiliar feeling that caught him off guard. She was busy preparing breakfast, her movements graceful and unhurried, as always. The dog was curled up at her feet, a picture of peace. She didn't hear him approach, and for a moment, he just watched her. The way she moved, the way she cared for the simplest things, made him wonder how he had ever lived without noticing it. He cleared his throat, and she looked up, a soft smile lighting up her face when she saw him. "Good morning, sir," she said, her voice as calm as ever. Dominic nodded, taking a step forward. Maria, he began, his voice uncharacteristically unsure. I've been thinking. Maria tilted her head slightly, waiting for him to continue. About everything, he added. About my life, about what matters about you. Maria's expression softened, and she set the knife down, sensing the seriousness in his tone. What do you mean? She asked quietly. Dominic took a deep breath, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. He didn't know how to say what he was feeling, but he knew he had to. I don't want to be that man anymore, he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. The one who only cares about power, about control. I don't want to be alone anymore, Maria. I don't want to push people away. Maria looked at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to understand the weight of his words. She had always known there was more to him than the Mafia boss persona he wore, but hearing him say it out loud was something entirely different. You're not alone, she said softly, her voice filled with understanding. You've never been alone, Dominic. He swallowed hard, feeling the truth of her words in a way he never had before. But I've been living like I am, he said quietly. And I don't want it anymore. I don't want to keep pretending that this, he gestured to the grand mansion around them, is all that matters. Maria's smile was small but genuine, and in that moment, Dominic felt a sense of relief he had never known. For the first time, he felt like he was taking control of his life in a way that didn't require domination or fear. It was a different kind of strength, one he had never allowed himself to embrace. What do you want, Dominic? Maria asked, her voice steady but soft. Dominic took a step closer to her, his eyes never leaving hers. I want to be better, he said simply. I want to be the kind of man who can care, who can build something that matters, not just something that lasts. The silence between them stretched out, but it was comfortable. There was no pressure, no expectations. Just two people, finally seeing each other for who they truly were. You can do that, Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper. You just have to let yourself. Dominic nodded, feeling the weight of her words sink in. For the first time, he realized that he didn't need to have all the answers. He didn't need to be perfect. He just needed to be willing to try. And for the first time in a long time, he was ready to do just that. Thank you, he said softly. For everything. Maria smiled again, this time with a warmth that reached her eyes. You don't need to thank me, she said. You just need to keep moving forward. And as Dominic stood there, in the quiet kitchen, surrounded by warmth and simple comfort, he realized that for the first time in his life, he was finally free. Not because of the empire he had built, but because of the person he had become, because of the choices he had made, and because of the connection he had found with Maria. The following days were different, and yet, they felt strangely familiar to Dominic. There was a quiet comfort in the air, a new routine that wasn't about power or control, but about being present, truly present. He had learned that the world he had spent so long building was not all there was. There was a part of him, one he had buried deep, wanting connection, wanting to care. It was something he had never given space to, but now, with Maria in his life, it felt impossible to ignore. He found himself thinking about her constantly, not just as his employee, but as someone who had become important to him. She wasn't just a maid, a background figure in the grand scheme of his life. No, she was much more. She was someone who had changed him in ways he hadn't thought possible. It was strange, the way everything felt different now. He spent less time focused on the next move in his criminal empire and more time thinking about what really mattered. He found himself enjoying the simple things. Eating dinner without the weight of 1,000 decisions hanging over him. Sharing small moments of conversation with Maria as they moved through the house. And yet, there was still an unspoken tension that neither of them had addressed. As close as they had become, there was still a line between them, one Dominic wasn't sure he could cross. Maria had been the one to break down his walls, but now he wondered if it was time for him to finally do the same. One evening, Dominic found himself walking toward the garden, the evening sun casting long shadows over the perfectly manicured lawn. He needed some air, a moment to think. He had a decision to make, but for the first time in his life, he didn't feel as though he had the answers. As he stepped outside, he was surprised to find Maria there, sitting quietly on one of the benches, her hands folded in her lap, staring out at the horizon. She had always been so composed, but tonight, there was a quiet sadness in her posture. Something in her seemed distant. Dominic approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. But as he got closer, she turned to face him, her eyes meeting his. "Maria," he said softly, sitting down beside her. "Is everything okay?" She looked at him for a moment, as if considering his question, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I'm fine," she replied, though her voice lacked the usual warmth it carried. "Just thinking." Dominic studied her for a moment, sensing that there was more to her words. She had always been so open with him, in her own way. But tonight, something was different. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice gentle. Maria hesitated, her gaze returning to the horizon. "About us," she said quietly. Dominic's heart skipped a beat. He had expected many things in this moment, but not this. "What do you mean?" he asked, the words slipping from his mouth before he could stop them. Maria turned to face him, her eyes searching his as if trying to understand his every thought. "I mean, I've been wondering," she began, "if this is really what you want. If you're truly ready for this change. For us." Dominic was taken aback by her question. He hadn't expected it, but now that she had asked it, he realized how much he had been avoiding it. He had let himself care, yes, but had he truly allowed himself to embrace what that meant? To acknowledge the shift in his heart? He didn't know. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice soft. "I don't know if I'm ready. I've spent my whole life living one way, building something that's not easy to let go of." Maria nodded slowly, as if she understood. "I know," she said, "but sometimes it's not about what we've built. It's about what we can build together." Dominic felt a strange pull at his chest. It wasn't something he could put into words, but he could feel it. Something in her words resonated with him, something that felt like the truth. But he wasn't sure if he was strong enough to face it. "What if it's too late?" he asked quietly, almost to himself. Maria's eyes softened, and she reached out, placing a hand on his. "It's never too late," she said, "as long as we're willing to try." Dominic looked down at her hand, his thoughts swirling in a storm of uncertainty. He had built his life on control, on certainty, but now, with Maria beside him, he realized that some things couldn't be controlled. Some things were worth taking a risk for, even if it meant stepping into the unknown. Slowly, he reached up and took her hand in his grip steady, but his heart racing. "I'm not sure what this means," he said, his voice low, "but I'm willing to find out." Maria smiled, the warmth returning to her expression. "That's all anyone can ask for," she said softly. Dominic's heart swelled, a mixture of hope and fear flooding him. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in his life, he didn't need them. He only needed to be willing to try. Together, they sat in the quiet garden, the fading sunlight casting a peaceful glow around them. The world outside still demanded his attention, but in that moment, with Maria beside him, Dominic felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of peace. It wasn't about power, it wasn't about control. It was about something more, something real. And for the first time in his life, Dominic was ready to let it in. The weeks that followed were a slow unraveling of the life Dominic had built. Each day brought new challenges, but it also brought unexpected moments of peace. He had started to let go of the need to control everything, and with Maria by his side, he discovered a new kind of strength, one that didn't rely on fear or power, but on connection and trust. The moments they shared, though simple, became his anchor. They worked side by side, and each passing day made Dominic more and more aware of how much he had changed. He no longer saw Maria as just his maid. She was someone who had become an integral part of his life, someone whose presence had begun to fill the spaces that power and control had once occupied. But despite this newfound connection, there was still something Dominic hadn't addressed, something that lingered between them like an unspoken question. He had been avoiding it, not out of fear, but because he didn't know what to say. He wasn't sure if he was ready to confront it, or if he even knew how. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the mansion was bathed in the soft glow of twilight, Dominic found himself in the living room, pacing. He had called a meeting earlier that day to discuss business, but his mind kept drifting back to Maria. He knew he couldn't continue like this, carrying this weight without addressing it. He needed to know where they stood, where this connection between them was going. He didn't want to go back to the way things had been, but he wasn't sure how to move forward, either. The sound of footsteps approaching snapped him out of his thoughts. He turned to find Maria standing in the doorway, her expression calm but curious. Is everything okay, sir? She asked, her voice steady. Dominic looked at her, his heart racing. He had never been good at showing vulnerability, but now, in this moment, he knew he had to. He couldn't keep hiding from the truth. Maria, he said, his voice quieter than usual. We need to talk. Maria raised an eyebrow, but she said nothing. She stepped into the room and stood silently, waiting for him to continue. I don't know how to say this, Dominic admitted, his hands clenching at his sides. But I can't keep pretending that things are just fine. I can't keep going like this, like nothing's changed. Because it has. Maria watched him closely, her expression unreadable. She could sense the weight in his words, the uncertainty in his voice. What has changed? She asked softly, her voice carrying a quiet understanding. Dominic exhaled slowly, his chest tight with the weight of the question. He took a step toward her, his eyes never leaving hers. You, he said simply. You've changed me, and I'm not sure what to do with it. Maria blinked, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, she said nothing, processing the words that Dominic had just spoken. I didn't mean to, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I didn't think you'd notice. Dominic's heart pounded in his chest. How could I not notice? He asked, his voice almost desperate. You've completely turned my world upside down. I've spent so long focusing on control, on power, and you've shown me something different, something I've been avoiding for so long. Maria stepped closer to him, her eyes searching his. I didn't set out to change your life, Dominic. I didn't even know if I could. But I think I understand now. I think I know what you're afraid of. Dominic's breath caught in his throat, his heart pounding louder. What am I afraid of? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Maria took another step forward, her gaze never leaving his. You're afraid of letting go, she said softly. Afraid of what happens if you stop controlling everything. But the truth is, you don't have to. You've always had the power to choose. You just didn't realize it. Dominic felt a knot form in his stomach. Her words were simple, but they cut through him in a way he hadn't expected. He had always believed that control was the only thing that mattered. That without it, he would lose everything. But Maria was showing him that there was another way. What if I can't let go? He asked, his voice raw with emotion. Maria's expression softened, and she reached out, placing a gentle hand on his arm. You don't have to let go all at once, she said. You don't have to change everything in one day. But you can start. You can start by trusting yourself and trusting me. Dominic looked down at her hand on his arm, the warmth of her touch spreading through him. He had spent so long building walls around himself, afraid of what might happen if he let anyone in. But now, with Maria standing in front of him, offering him something he had never expected, understanding, compassion, and trust, he knew that it was time to make a choice. I want to trust you, he said quietly. I want to let go, but I don't know how. Maria gave him a small, reassuring smile. It's okay. We'll figure it out together. Dominic nodded, the tension in his chest easing for the first time in what felt like forever. For the first time, he wasn't alone. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid. The weight of the past, the pressure of maintaining control, didn't feel as heavy as it had before. Maybe it was time to let go, to trust that the world wouldn't fall apart if he did. Together, they could build something new, something stronger than the empire he had once thought defined him. Something real. As the room settled into a peaceful silence, Dominic felt the truth of Maria's words sink deep into his heart. And for the first time, he believed it. The change in Dominic was subtle at first, but it was undeniable. He had started to approach his world differently, to look at things from a perspective he had never allowed himself to consider. It wasn't just about power and control anymore. It was about connection, about the moments that made life worth living. Maria had shown him that, and as they spent more time together, something shifted between them. They no longer existed in separate worlds. Their lives, once distinct, began to blend together in a way that felt natural. But even with all these changes, Dominic knew he had to make a decision. He had to face what had been building between them, something he couldn't ignore any longer. Their bond had deepened, but what did it mean? What would it mean for him, for her, for the life he had spent so long creating? These thoughts ran through his mind as he walked through the mansion late one evening. The world outside was quiet, the city lights casting soft shadows across the large windows, and for the first time in a long while, Dominic didn't feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. He had let go of some of that weight, but now, something else was gnawing at him. Maria had become more than just a figure in his life. She was someone who had made him see himself differently, who had made him want to be better. As he made his way to the kitchen, he found her there, just as she had been so many times before. She was standing by the counter, carefully slicing vegetables for dinner, the quiet hum of the mansion's systems the only sound in the room. It was a peaceful scene, but Dominic could sense the change in the air. It wasn't just the peace. It was the connection, the unspoken understanding that had developed between them. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her, before he finally spoke. "Maria," he said, his voice low, "we need to talk." She turned, her expression calm but alert. "What's on your mind?" she asked, her voice steady, as though she already knew this moment had been coming. Dominic stepped into the room, his eyes never leaving hers. "I've been thinking about everything," he said, his voice full of uncertainty. "About the changes in my life, about us." Maria didn't say anything right away. She simply waited, giving him the space to say what he needed to say. "I've been holding back," he continued, his voice tinged with regret. "I've been afraid to admit it, but the truth is, I can't keep pretending that I don't care. That what's happening between us doesn't matter." Maria's gaze softened, and for the first time, Dominic saw something in her eyes that made his heart skip a beat. It wasn't pity, it wasn't sympathy, it was understanding. She had always understood him in ways he hadn't realized until now. "What are you saying, Dominic?" she asked quietly, her voice gentle. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I'm saying that I care about you. More than I should. More than I've ever allowed myself to care about anyone." There was a long pause. Maria didn't move, didn't speak, but Dominic could see the surprise in her eyes. He wasn't sure if she had expected this, but he had to say it. "I've spent so much of my life building walls around myself. But you—" He stopped, frustrated at his inability to find the right words. "You've made me want to tear them down. You've made me realize that there's more to life than control. There's more to it than fear and power." Maria's expression softened further, and she stepped toward him. "Dominic," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I never wanted you to change for me. I just wanted you to see that you're more than the walls you've built. You're more than the power you wield." He looked down at her hand as it reached out to touch his arm, her fingers warm against his skin. For a moment, he couldn't speak. The reality of what he had just confessed hit him all at once, and he felt a wave of emotion surge through him. It was vulnerability, something he had never truly allowed himself to feel, and it terrified him. But for the first time in his life, he didn't want to run from it. He didn't want to hide behind the walls he had built. He wanted to let them fall. Slowly, he met her eyes again. "What does this mean for us?" he asked, his voice uncertain. Maria gave him a small, soft smile, one that reached her eyes and made his heart flutter in a way he hadn't expected. "It means we move forward. Together," she said simply. Dominic felt a weight lift from his chest, a sense of relief he hadn't known he was carrying. He hadn't expected it to be this simple, this clear. But here, with Maria, it was. For the first time, he felt like he was making the right choice. "Together," he repeated, the word tasting different on his tongue than it ever had before. He reached out and took her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "I don't know what's ahead," he said, his voice low, "but I want to face it with you." Maria's smile widened, and she squeezed his hand. "We'll figure it out," she said. Dominic nodded, the uncertainty that had plagued him for so long slowly dissipating. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. He wasn't alone anymore. And as they stood together in the quiet of the kitchen, Dominic knew that he was ready for whatever came next, because for the first time, he had someone by his side who truly understood him. The days that followed were a new kind of peace for Dominic. He had made the choice to let go, to stop controlling every aspect of his life, and it was freeing in a way he hadn't anticipated. The weight of power and dominance still lingered in the back of his mind, but each time he looked at Maria, it became easier to push it aside. They worked together in harmony now, no longer just employer and employee, but something more. There was a shared understanding between them that transcended words. They spent time in the mansion, cooking together, talking about everything and nothing, and for the first time in Dominic's life, he felt like he was actually living. He no longer had to be the cold, calculating man he had once been. With Maria, he didn't need to hide behind the walls he had built. He didn't need to constantly prove himself. But even as he embraced this new chapter, there were still moments of doubt that crept in. He wasn't blind to the reality of the world he lived in, the dangers, the enemies he had made over the years, the people who relied on him for protection, the allies who looked to him for guidance, and the enemies who waited for him to falter. He couldn't let his guard completely down, but for the first time, he realized that he didn't have to bear the weight of it all alone. Maria was there, and she was his anchor. One afternoon, after spending most of the day with Maria in the kitchen, Dominic received a call that made his stomach tighten. It was from an old associate, a reminder of the world he had left behind but could never fully escape. The message was simple but urgent. They're making their move. Be ready. The voice on the other end of the line was cold, calculated, the voice of someone who didn't care about anything other than the game. Dominic's jaw clenched as he ended the call, the weight of the situation settling back into him like an old, familiar coat. He stood for a moment, staring out of the window, his thoughts racing. This was the life he had built, the life he had tried to leave behind. But the reality of his position was impossible to ignore. He couldn't simply walk away from everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed to build. His empire had made him who he was, but now, for the first time, he wasn't sure if it was worth it. He was standing on the precipice of everything he had ever known, torn between the life he had lived and the life he was beginning to build with Maria. As he turned to walk out of the room, he saw her standing there, watching him with those eyes that seemed to understand more than he could ever put into words. "Are you okay?" Maria asked softly, her voice full of concern. Dominic paused, his hand resting on the doorframe as he looked at her. The weight of the world seemed to press in from all sides, but in this moment, with Maria standing before him, he felt a flicker of hope. "I don't know," he said, his voice quiet. "I thought I could leave it all behind. But the world doesn't let you walk away so easily." Maria stepped forward, her expression soft but resolute. "You don't have to face it alone, Dominic," she said, her voice steady. "You have me. And maybe it's time to face it together." The words struck him like a lightning bolt. Together. The simple truth that he had been avoiding, that he had been afraid to admit to himself. The reality was, Maria had become more than just his companion. She had become his partner, the one person who made him feel like he wasn't just a product of the world he had created. She made him believe that there was still something worth fighting for. He swallowed hard, the reality of what was happening slowly settling in. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent so long building this life, this empire. I don't know how to change that." Maria smiled gently, a warmth in her eyes that made Dominic's chest tighten. "You don't have to change everything at once," she said softly. "But you can change the way you live it. You don't have to do this by yourself anymore." For the first time, Dominic realized that he didn't have to choose between his past and his future. He didn't have to sacrifice one for the other. There was a way forward, a way to keep the life he had built while also embracing the life he wanted with Maria. It wouldn't be easy, but he wasn't alone anymore. He wasn't the same man he had been when he walked into that mansion all those years ago. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Dominic took a step forward, closing the distance between them. For a long moment, neither of them said anything, but the unspoken understanding between them was louder than any words could have been. Finally, Dominic spoke, his voice steady and certain. "I'm ready," he said, "ready to face it, whatever it is. But I'm not doing it alone." Maria smiled, her eyes sparkling with something deeper than affection. "Together," she said softly. And in that moment, Dominic knew that whatever the future held, they would face it side by side. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty, but also a renewed sense of purpose. Dominic and Maria had come to a quiet agreement, an unspoken understanding that their lives were now intertwined in ways neither of them could have imagined. Dominic knew he had a choice to make, but it was no longer as clear-cut as it once was. He had always believed that the world was black and white, that he had to choose between his empire and a different kind of life. But with Maria by his side, he saw that there were shades of gray he had never considered before. He had spent years building his empire, cementing his position as one of the most powerful men in the city, but now he found himself questioning everything he had done to get there. The power, the control, the fear, it had all been a shield, a way to protect himself from the vulnerability of true connection. And yet, here was Maria, offering him something completely different: honesty, trust, and a chance to change. One evening, as the city lights twinkled outside the mansion's windows, Dominic sat in his office, staring at the papers in front of him. The familiar chaos of the business was still there, the endless decisions, the power struggles, and the old enemies who were just waiting for the right moment to strike. But something was different now. He wasn't as consumed by it. His mind kept returning to Maria, to the moments they had shared in the quiet corners of the mansion, the times when they had simply been themselves, without the roles they played in the world outside. He thought about what she had said, the idea that he didn't have to do it alone. He had always believed that he was the only one who could carry the weight of his world, but Maria had shown him that he didn't have to. As the clock ticked on, Dominic made a decision. He couldn't keep living in the shadow of his past. He had to face the choices he had made, and he had to make new ones. With Maria, he could find a way to protect what he had built without losing himself in the process. He couldn't go back to the man he once was, the man who controlled everything with fear and manipulation. It was time to embrace a new way, a way that included trust, vulnerability, and the possibility of something more. Later that night, Dominic found Maria in the garden. The cool evening air wrapped around them as they stood side by side, looking up at the stars. There was a quiet comfort between them now, a sense of calm that had replaced the tension of the past. He turned to her, his heart beating a little faster than usual. "Maria," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I've been thinking about what you said, about not doing this alone." She looked at him, her expression soft but knowing. "And?" she asked, her voice gentle. "And I want you to know that I'm ready," he said, his words coming out more easily than he had expected. "Ready to face everything. Together." Maria's eyes softened, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. She didn't need to say anything. She simply reached out, taking his hand in hers. The gesture was simple, but it spoke volumes. Dominic felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had made his choice, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path. "We're in this together," she said softly. Dominic nodded, squeezing her hand. The city lights below them seemed to glow brighter, as if the world itself was acknowledging the change he had made. For the first time, Dominic didn't feel like he was standing at the edge of something he couldn't control. Instead, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. With Maria, the days ahead wouldn't be easy. He knew that. There would still be challenges, still be enemies who would stop at nothing to tear him down. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. He had Maria by his side, and together, they would face whatever came their way. The empire he had built was still there, but now it felt different. It wasn't just a symbol of power, it was a symbol of what he had created, what he had fought for, and what he wanted to protect. And for the first time in his life, he realized that it wasn't just the empire that mattered. It was the people in it. It was Maria, and it was the future they could build together. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, it was full of possibility. As they stood in the garden, the cool breeze ruffling their hair, Dominic felt something shift inside him. He was no longer the man who had built his empire out of fear. He was a man who was ready to build something new, something that didn't require him to lose himself. And in that moment, with Maria standing beside him, he knew that this was just the beginning. As the weeks passed, Dominic and Maria's bond grew stronger. There was a new rhythm to their lives, a shared sense of purpose that had not existed before. They were no longer confined to the roles they had once played. Dominic, the feared Mafia boss, and Maria, his devoted maid, had found something far more meaningful, something that transcended power and position. Together, they navigated the complexities of their lives, slowly building a future that was different from the past, a future where they both could finally be free. The mansion, once a fortress of isolation, now felt like a home. Dominic had not only begun to tear down the walls around his heart, but had also begun to embrace a new kind of strength, one that came from vulnerability and trust. He no longer saw his empire as a symbol of just power, but as something he had to protect, not through fear or control, but through loyalty, respect, and love. Maria had shown him a way forward, one that he never thought possible. But even as they built something new, the past was never far behind. The weight of his past decisions, the enemies who still lurked in the shadows, and the responsibilities that came with his position were never completely forgotten. The world Dominic had once ruled with an iron fist still existed, and it had a way of demanding his attention at the most inconvenient times. One evening, after a long day of quiet moments with Maria, Dominic received a call from one of his closest associates. The message was brief, but the implication was clear. Things were changing, and not for the better. An old rival had surfaced, and the delicate peace Dominic had worked so hard to build was now in jeopardy. As he listened to the voice on the other end of the line, the reality of his position settled back into him like a familiar weight. He couldn't ignore it. His empire was under threat, and it was up to him to protect it. The moment he ended the call, his mind immediately began to race. But just as quickly, his thoughts turned to Maria. She was the one constant in his life now, the one person who had helped him rediscover a part of himself he had buried for years. And in this moment, Dominic realized that he couldn't face this alone, not this time. He couldn't go back to the cold, calculating man he had been before. Maria had taught him that. He needed to involve her, to face this challenge together. As he walked down the hallway to find her, he felt a sense of uncertainty. It was one thing to have her by his side in the quiet moments, but this was different. This was business. This was the world he had once tried to leave behind, and now it was pulling him back in. He found Maria sitting in the living room, the soft glow of the fireplace lighting her face. She looked up as he entered, sensing the change in his demeanor. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice calm but filled with concern. Dominic stood in the doorway for a moment, gathering his thoughts. He had never been good at opening up, at sharing the weight he carried, but with Maria, it felt necessary. "There's a problem," he said simply. "A threat to the empire I've built. And this time, I can't handle it alone." Maria's expression shifted, but she didn't hesitate. "We'll face it together," she said, her voice steady. It was exactly what he needed to hear. In that moment, Dominic realized how far they had come. He no longer saw Maria as just his employee, but as an equal, as someone whose strength matched his own. Together, they could handle anything. They spent the next few hours strategizing, going over the details of the threat. It wasn't easy, and there were moments of tension as they worked through the complexities of the situation, but Dominic felt something he had never felt before: peace. He was no longer doing this alone. The challenges ahead were still daunting, but with Maria by his side, he felt more certain than ever that they could overcome them. The night wore on, and as they finalized their plan, Dominic looked at Maria. She was focused, determined, and yet, in the quiet moments between their discussions, he saw something else in her eyes: trust. She trusted him, and in that trust, Dominic found the strength he needed to face whatever came next. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice full of gratitude. Maria gave him a small, knowing smile. "There's no need to thank me," she replied softly. "We're in this together." As the night came to a close, and the weight of their decisions settled into them both, Dominic realized that this was the moment that had changed everything. He had spent his life trying to control the world around him, but now he understood that the true strength lay in sharing that burden, in trusting someone else with it. And in that, he found his greatest victory. The next day, as they set their plan into motion, Dominic and Maria faced the world not as separate individuals, but as partners, ready to confront whatever challenges lay ahead, together. If you're a fan of gripping romance stories that delve into the complexities of love and personal transformation, this one is a must-read. In these captivating romance stories, Dominic, a powerful mafia boss, discovers a side of himself he never knew existed through his relationship with Maria, a quiet and compassionate maid. Over time, their bond grows into something deep and meaningful, proving that even the most hardened hearts can be changed by love. These romance stories explore not just the emotional journey of finding love, but also the struggle to let go of past pain and embrace vulnerability. As Dominic confronts his past and chooses to face his challenges with Maria by his side, we see the evolution of their relationship, one filled with trust, understanding, and passion. The beauty of these romance stories lies in the way they show how two people, from vastly different worlds, can come together and change each other's lives in ways they never imagined. The characters' journey unfolds slowly but surely, drawing the reader in with every twist and turn. Through their challenges, they both learn that true love isn't just about power or control. It's about finding someone who will stand with you, no matter what. For those who love romance stories that blend deep emotional connection with intense moments of vulnerability, this is the perfect story to get lost in. With each passing day, Dominic and Maria become more intertwined in ways that reflect the true meaning of partnership and love. As they face their challenges together, these romance stories remind us that love, in its purest form, is the most powerful force of all.